Good. Well, it's great to be with you this morning. Our campus pastors, I'm a little late in saying this, but our campus pastors did a great job over Easter weekend, especially our volunteers as well, and those in our kids programs at all of our campuses. We should give a big hand to everybody that did such a great job. I didn't have a chance to show my appreciation, but that's been fantastic. I don't know if you realize it, but we're kind of in a really good phase in our church right now. At Renew, over the Easter weekend, we hit a new kind of high mark that we've ever hit before. Across all of our campuses, we had like over 550 people showing up over Easter, which is really pretty cool. So God's doing some really neat things. We're about so much more than the numbers here at our church, but we are encouraged that people are finding a home with us and getting connected with us, and we're really happy about that. We want to connect with as many people as we can. Speaking of people, if you were with us prior to Easter, you would remember that we did a three-part series called Everyday People. And in that series, Pastor Wade from Mayfield West and myself, we kind of did some tag team teaching on that and just kind of talked about our identity as followers of Jesus. We talked about three different aspects of our identity as children of God. And the first thing we talked about is that we're family. If you remember this, we really, dug into this concept of our identity, that we're followers of Jesus, that we're more than just friends together, that we're actually brothers and sisters and spiritual family, that we have the same Father who is God, who loves us, and we're in this great family that He has created. And as brothers and sisters, we're committed to each other in this family. There's a strong bond there. So we talked about that. The second aspect was that we're missionaries. And Pastor Wade encouraged us to forget everything that we know about missionaries or that we may have learned about missionaries. I remember for me growing up, it was that they always brought those little carousel things with the slides, the Kodak ones, and they showed their pictures. That was my recollection. And they also dressed very badly. But no fault of theirs, they hadn't been around, right? So what are you going to do? But that was just my memories as a kid. But anyway, we are missionaries, right? It's not just people we send to other countries, but we are missionaries. It's part of our identity, right? In our own communities, God is sending us to be a light and to share love right in our own neighborhoods. And we're constantly inviting others to join into this great family that we're a part of, right? Family is the first part of our identity, and then missionaries. We're inviting people to be part of this great family that God has given us. Sometimes we get branded as, evangelizing or proselytizing or something that ends in izing, which always sounds very clinical and maybe even a little bit aggressive. Not that there's nothing good to some of those words, but the point is that we just love our family. We love what we have, what God has done in our lives, and we want to share that with other people. We want others to enjoy the kind of life that God offers to us. It's kind of like that Wendy's ad. I don't know if you remember the Wendy's ad that says, "It's better here," right? A lot of my illustrations go to fast food. Sorry, forgive me for that. But I just think of that. It's better here. And that's how I feel about my life in God's family. I want other people to be part of it. And so it's kind of natural to tell them about it. In God's family, you have the sense of community. You have God's wisdom that's poured out into your life and your family's life. You have purpose and hope and all of these things. And it's so amazing. The third aspect that we talked about of our identity is that we're servants, that we're not here to be served, but we're here to serve. And that Christ gave us that perfect example to follow, that He lived His life as a servant, and then to culminate all of that, He actually laid down His very life for us. And as Christians, ones who claim to follow Christ, that this is the example that He's given to us, that we actually find our life by losing it, that serving actually brings us our greatest joy. And I talked in that third week about our DNA, that our DNA actually screams out to serve people, that we find our greatest fulfillment in doing that. And so that's our identity as God's children. Now, you may be tuning in this morning from any one of our campuses or online, and just kind of checking this thing out. And many of you may say, "Oh, well, I'm not really quite there yet. I don't really know if I'm a Christian per se. I don't know if I call myself a child of God at this point." You're maybe still checking things out, which is great. I would just encourage you to forget everything that you know about church and about Christians as we launch into this series. Just try to put those things on hold. The truth is that many people say that they're Christian, but they really don't understand the essence of what Jesus talked about, of what it means to be a Christian. And it's actually fortuitous that you're here today, because you're going to get an inside look at how the children of God are supposed to live. That's what this series is about, how God intended for us to live. And you're going to get a good picture of that. I think by the end of this 4-week series, you're going to have a pretty good look at what God meant for it to be to live in His family. What does this look like? What do your day-to-day activities actually consist of? For those who do consider themselves children of God, this series is the perfect follow-up to our Everyday People series. As we talked about a family of missionary servants, I could actually see the lights going on for people as we use those terms. Family of missionary servants. Like I could literally see the lights going on for people. Well, not for everybody. For you guys in there, I couldn't see the lights going on, all right? But I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking, all right? Because I've been doing this a long time, and when I see certain looks, I know what people are thinking, and just using these words. And so when we got talking about things like I'm part of God's family, that I'm called to be a missionary, to bring love and light to my community, that I'm a servant and I'm made to find joy in serving, that it's my DNA, I could see people's eyes opening up and saying, yeah, I agree, that is what it's for. That is what my life is about. That is my identity. But, here's the thing, how do I possibly accomplish this in my busy life? How do I possibly live in this family that I'm a part of, but particularly, how do I live as a missionary? How do I live as a servant when I'm so busy just getting the stuff done that needs to get done? You see, I do know what you were thinking, right? That's just what everyone's thinking. They're like, I don't know how I can get all that done. My life is already so busy. You say, I go to work, I go to school, I commute, right? I've got activities, my kids are in activities. I'm so stretched already that I just need my downtime, that little bit of time that I got left, I just need that for me, right? And you know what I would say to that? I would say you're absolutely right. You're right. It's a busy world that we live in, and you do work hard, and you do commute, and you do have a number of different activities, and that's why we need this follow-up series called Everyday Stuff. This is what we're going to talk about over the next 4 weeks. You see, the only way that we're going to be effective as a family of missionary servants is if we learn to make this, something that we can do in our everyday lives. It's the only way that it can happen. It's everyday people doing everyday stuff. That's why we're calling this second part of the series Everyday Stuff. The last thing you probably need is another program right now, right? Another time commitment, another chunk of time in your busy week. You're like, no, I can't handle it, right? Churches are famous for this. We create so many events and programs that often there's no time left to live out our identity, to live it out naturally in our communities with the people that we naturally come into contact with during the course of a week. What I'm going to show you in this series is that life is actually the program. It's not about creating programs, and we have some programs at Renew for sure. We try to limit the number that we have, and they're very good. But the program, you need to understand, as you live out your identity, it's not some program the church creates. The program is life. Life is the place where you live out this identity, and as you live that out, you're going to really come alive and discover, yeah, this is where I was made to flourish as a child of God. The cool part is that God has built certain rhythms into life to make this a natural thing. And that's what we're going to look at in this series. You can even see it in the logo, that there's 6 rhythms that we naturally engage in all of the time. And if we can just tap into those, we can actually find our identity and live out that identity, especially of being a missionary servant with this spiritual family that God has given us. So here's the question. What are the everyday rhythms of life? What are they? Do you know what the natural rhythms are that you go through in your life? What do people do on a daily basis, a weekly basis, monthly, annually, some things? But what are those rhythms that we just kind of naturally do? Well, here's what they are, and these are the things that we're going to talk about, okay, over the next 4 weeks. We're going to talk about eating. Eating's something we do pretty regularly, right? We're going to talk about listening. We're going to talk about stories, telling stories. It's a big part of your life. You may not have identified that, but actually sharing stories and listening to stories is a big part of your life. We're going to talk about blessing. We're going to talk about celebrating. And then the last one is recreating or recreate. That's the last one. So those are the 6 rhythms we're going to talk about. And over these next 4 weeks, I'm going to break them down for you. And you're going to see just how biblical, how natural, and how practical these rhythms are. All right? This is going to be great. Now, here's the first one, and I think the first one may be my favorite. Eat. Rhythm number one is eat. You're all on board with me right now, right? Like, I love it when the audience is tuned in, right? Eat. Yeah, all right. You're going to be out of here pretty soon. You're going to get to go eat pretty soon, all right? Now, most of us are in the habit of eating 3 times a day, at least, okay? I have to admit, I'm in the habit of a little more than that, okay? But sometimes I cut out breakfast so I can eat later in the day, which is a very healthy thing to do. Don't quote me on that. But, think about this. 21 meals in a week. That's a lot of eating, even if you're just keeping it to 3 meals a day, right? That's a lot of time spent nourishing our bodies, and we've really got no choice. I mean, the most choice you have is that you take, like, supplements and stuff instead of actually eating food. But why do that? Like, God has made this rhythm an enjoyable part of your life. He really has. And the more that you kind of get into food and you recognize how good food is, and, you get into all the different, flavors and stuff, it's really an amazing thing in the way that God's created it. And this is a rhythm that has existed from the beginning of time. In fact, we tend to look at the world, this fallen kind of sinful world that we're in, and we kind of, picture everything as happening within it. But the truth is that this whole thing of eating to sustain ourselves is something that happened before the fall, and it's something that's going to happen in the future, even in heaven. The Bible talks about this. In the eternal state, we're going to eat from trees to sustain our eternal life. We're going to eat fruit from trees, just like they did back in the Garden of Eden before the fall. The Bible talks about that? So this idea is actually bigger. This idea of sustaining ourselves physically and even spiritually through food is a huge concept. And it's physical, but it's also metaphysical in the experience. And I want to talk about that a little this morning. As we eat, we nourish our physical bodies, but we also find communion with other people. It's a very spiritual experience, sharing food with people. Very spiritual. We come to a table with a common need. We come as human beings that require nourishment, and we sit down together, and we eat of food together, and we kind of share in our humanity together as we're doing this. It's a very powerful thing. In Eastern culture, there is a much greater appreciation for this, I think, than we have here in the West. Here in the West, we kind of eat to live. But in other places in the world, they kind of live to eat, and they make it a bigger thing, and they really, appreciate the spiritual side of this. You need to remember, in all of Israel's celebrations, you go back in the Old Testament, you look at all of the different things that the nation of Israel celebrated. All of the celebrations revolved around food. They were all feasts and festivals. Food was part of all of those things. It was a big thing that God built into their celebrations. Jesus actually did some of his greatest ministry in and around meal times. You ever take the time to think about that? Right? Whether he's feeding huge crowds out on the hillside, doing miracles, teaching his disciples around a table, sharing a Passover meal with his best friends before being crucified. Like, it's always revolving around food. This is the way they lived. In Luke chapter 22, we just came through the Easter season, which of course evolved from the Passover, and it says, Jesus said to his disciples, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Right? He had that intense desire. You know what that's like sometimes, like at a special time of year, you get together with family. Some of you are like, I don't like to get together with my family. But some of us do, right? Like those ones that you actually enjoy getting together with. When you think about getting together to have a meal, like at Christmas or something, and you're going to have all those people you love together, like it's a precious time. And that's what Jesus was feeling right there. He's like, I can't wait to get together with my brothers and sisters before, I have to suffer. And Jesus craved that mealtime fellowship. It's not surprising that the most common ordinance that he left us as his followers, you ever think about that? It's called the Lord's Supper. Like it's built into everything, this idea of eating. It's like he planned for our most precious times together to revolve around a meal. And Jesus himself, as we sit down to take communion, he becomes our spiritual food as we're nourishing our physical bodies. It's this amazing picture. We're nourishing our physical body, but the image is that, right, the spiritual nourishment. Jesus talked to his disciples in a metaphysical sense. He says, this this is my body, this is my blood. He was speaking metaphysically, that in a spiritual sense, he nourishes them. In fact, Jesus called himself the bread of life. In John 6, take a look at this. Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. If you're one of those people that's still checking out God or the church or, Christianity, I challenge you with that statement. Jesus says he's the bread of life. He's talking here in a spiritual sense, right? That if you actually find him in the way that he describes, you will never be spiritually hungry or thirsty anymore. That's a powerful statement. You need to check into that. Some have suggested that Jesus connected our communion service to a meal so that we would actually think about him every time we ate a meal, which is very possible, right? Think about that. We eat 21 times a week at least, that every time we sit down, that's kind of a time where we connect with God, a spiritual experience, more than just stuffing our face with food, that we're actually making a spiritual experience out of that it's a chance to worship. There's stories of kind of Jews that would, take the time when they would eat a meal to thank God, and they would back everything up, right? They would start with, God who gives the sun and the rain that nourishes the soil, and the seed that falls into the soil that produces the grain, and the grain that then can be made into the bread. And they would turn it into an entire worship service, just eating that food, right? We can actually do that as we're eating. It's a chance to fellowship. This is another spiritual component. When we sit down and we eat food, if we can eat with other people, it becomes something really precious. We talk about the Lord's table, we call it communion because it's union together with other people. And we do that around food. It's a chance to embrace others. Jesus demonstrated this better than anyone, that food was an opportunity to embrace people. Jesus used food to connect with them all the time. He was actually called a friend of sinners because he ate with them. In Luke chapter 15, verse 2, it says, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. You see, that was really significant in their mind, because in Eastern culture, to eat with someone was to say that you appreciated them, that you were friends with them, and that you accepted them. And they couldn't handle that Jesus actually accepted people who didn't have it all together. Do you want to be like Jesus? The answer is yes. Nod your head, okay? Do you want to be like Jesus? Eat with people. Eat with them. It's a very simple rhythm. It's built into your life. You're doing it at least 21 times a week. Just take some of that time and eat with people. Something magical happens when you do that. Walls come down. Deep bonds are created. Friendships form with people. And love and acceptance are communicated. Guys, like I say, we eat at least 21 times a week, usually more. What if we got in the habit of eating just one of those? You keep 20 to yourself. You just take one of those to eat with somebody else. What happens? Great things start to happen. 3 years ago, I invited an author named Caesar Kalinowski to speak at our national conference. This is when I was the executive director of our fellowship, and I really liked the stuff that he had been teaching about. Got an opportunity, invited him to come, and he accepted. So he came and spoke at our conference. He actually ended up coming 2 years because we needed someone else on short notice the next year, and he came. So I got to know Caesar and really appreciate a lot of his teaching, read a number of his books. Caesar's actually a friend and co-laborer of Jeff Vanderstelt, who wrote the book Saturate that we've been talking about quite a bit over the last number of months here at Renew Church. They founded a movement called Soma together, and they're really leading the way in teaching Christians how to live in these 6 rhythms. So anyway, the next year after I invited Caesar to come to this conference, I had the opportunity with a number of pastors in our fellowship to actually go and visit Caesar. And like Caesar is wont to do, it wasn't just meeting somewhere in some random building. It was in his home. So we came to his home, and he opened the home up. His wife was there, and he spent the whole morning teaching us. But then he said, okay, guys, we're done now for the day. And for the rest of the day, we're just gonna enjoy each other's company. And I'm like, wow, this is like so different from what you usually get. So we went upstairs. His wife had made this amazing meal for us. They got out like this really nice wine, and we're just like chilling, all these pastors, and we're like, wow, this is like an unusual thing for us to be able to just enjoy, right, company around food. You know, the cool thing is that Caesar really practices what he preaches. That wasn't just a lesson for us, although it really served as a lesson. That's the way he lives his life. And so as we're sitting there in Tacoma, Washington, God's kind of, working in our minds around this stuff. And one of the things that Caesar said really sticks out in my mind and to many of the others that were there. And he made the statement, how bad do you have to hate someone to not even eat one meal with them in a week? How bad do you have to hate someone? And it's a really good question. Caesar and Jeff built their entire church movement around eating meals in homes. And like I say, he lived what he preached. You know, it should be so natural for us as missionaries and as servants. Think about this. It should be so natural for us to reach out to people and then to serve them a meal. It should be so natural for us to do that. That's our DNA. Like, we're built to do this kind of stuff. That's why the New Testament reminds us to be hospitable, right? It's to serve those needs of other people, but it's also so that we live out our purpose. In Hebrews chapter 13, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. In 1 Peter chapter 4, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. You see, when we're hospitable, we meet other people's deepest needs, but we also fulfill our own deepest needs as missionary servants. Don't ever forget that. God's not just commanding you to do something because he needs to get some job done. He's telling you to live out your identity. He wants you to experience the greatest fulfillment that you can have in your life. And you'll be amazed just by serving someone a meal, hosting them, having them around your table, what amazing things could happen. I also want you to remember this as we talk about eat as the first rhythm. Remember that the first part of our identity is that we are family, right? So don't be shy to do this together, right? You say, well, I'm kind of shy to host people. Well, invite some friends over and host people together. Do this as a Renew group, right? Work together as a Renew group to host some kind of a get-together. It doesn't have to be a full meal. It could just be dessert, wine and cheese, whatever. Something that's just getting people around the table together. It's a natural rhythm, guys. It takes no more time and energy than you're already expending. Okay? First rhythm, eat. It's a good one. Okay? Second rhythm is listen. Listen. Now, before we get into talking about listening to others, let's get the first things first here. The first part of listening is that we need to start listening to God. You know, we sometimes complain about not knowing God's will, but God has promised to speak to his children. He has. God does speak to us, not necessarily in an audible voice, but he speaks in our heart, and it's, very perceivable. We know that he's speaking to us. His Holy Spirit, the Bible says, indwells us when we are his children. And his voice is there. He guides us. In fact, Jesus promised that in John chapter 16. Look at what he says. It says, when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own. He will speak only what he hears, and he will tell you what is yet to come. You see that 3 times in that verse. Jesus says he does lead you. He's there, that you can listen for the Spirit to guide you. And so the problem when we feel that God is being silent, think about this. According to what Jesus is saying here, the problem when God seems really silent in our lives is not that he has stopped talking. It's that we probably have stopped listening. Because the Holy Spirit is always active. He wants to communicate to us. It's what he does. Jesus said so. He's constantly leading us and guiding us and teaching us. So the only other option is that we're not listening if we feel that we're not hearing his voice. Now, the voice of God is quiet. The prophet Elijah discovered that in the middle of all kinds of loud sounds and distractions, that it was actually a very quiet whisper that he had to listen for. And it takes a diligent listening heart to hear the voice of God. In Jeremiah chapter 29, God spoke through the prophet and said, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. And so you need to listen intently to hear what God is telling you. But one of the natural rhythms of God's children is to listen. Prayer is good, Bible reading is good, But guys, we also need to listen. We talk a lot about prayer. We talk a lot about Bible reading. We don't talk as much about listening, which is a big part of the process. See, here in the West, we're not very good at listening. We're distracted by 100 different things. We're distracted by our busy schedules, by all of the activities that we're involved in. We're distracted by the television. We're distracted by the internet and social media and Fortnite. Got to throw in Fortnite, right? We're distracted by so many different things. And guys, when this happens, we fail to live out our God-given identity. Remember, we talked about this in the other series, that the evil one, he wants to get us distracted so that we fail to live out our identity. The same thing is happening here. We fail to live out our God-given identity when we stop listening. Look at what Paul said in Romans chapter 8. He says, "For those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God." In other words, what's the test of someone being an actual child of God? It's that they're being led by the Spirit of God. It means you're listening. When's the last time you used that as your definition for what it means to be a follower of Jesus? We like to define it in a lot of different ways. There's a definition for you. It's someone who listens to God. That's a child of God. You're being led by Him. Are you a child of God? Are you listening to what the Holy Spirit is saying? Is that part of your daily routine? As we listen to God, you see, He directs us. He leads us into the right places. He connects us with the right people. He brings us into the right conversations. And this is why it's so important before we ever get to listening to other people that first we listen to God. Because He's going to save us a whole lot of trouble. He's going to lead us into the right places and into the right conversations. So there we're ready to listen. And our heart is tuned to God and is tuned to the other person. And that brings us to the second step in listening, and that is to listening to others. Now here's the thing, guys. We're talking about natural rhythms. You already interface with so many people in the course of a week. You really do. You probably have never taken the time to actually count the number of people. I would challenge you, do it this week. Count the number of people you actually interface with in the course of a week. It's a lot of people. Family, neighbors, coworkers, fellow students, friends, community members. There's so many different people that you rub shoulders with in a week. The question is, are you listening? Are you paying attention? Do you care? Are you asking people, what's going on in your life? And then are you zipping this long enough just to actually hear what's going on in their life? In Proverbs 18:13, wisdom says, to answer before listening, that is foolishness and shame. And in James chapter 1, the brother of Jesus said, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak. That's wisdom. Guys, here's what I've found, is that people are really interesting. Really interesting. In fact, the more people I meet, I say, wow, you're way more interesting than I am. People are so interesting. As you listen, you'll be reminded of a number of things. First of all, you'll be reminded that that's a person made in God's image, just like you. They're just as important to God, that they're important to a whole bunch of other people, that they're unique, that they have special gifts and abilities, and you go, wow, that's so amazing. And they're just like us. They're broken, they're affected by sin, but even in the middle of all that, they're full of potential because they're made in God's image and a loved, child of God. And as you listen, a part of you is going to come alive as you listen. And so I just challenge you, listen to people this week and just watch what happens. Take the time, and as they speak and then they stop, say, no, tell me more. Probe a little deeper, and just let them talk. Just this past week, I had the chance to chat with some of the parents of my son's hockey team as we wrapped up our season. And one man, as I was talking with him, he told me about his passion for music. It was interesting because I had no idea. I had no idea that he loved music. He told me how he will be playing in some of the local pubs. He actually mentioned one that I go to fairly often, and I'm like, email me. I will be there. He said, yeah, okay. It's amazing what you find out when you listen. I was coaching his son all season. I never took the time to connect with him. Never took the time just to listen and to ask. Tell me more. By the way, that conversation came up as we were at a restaurant eating food. Right? Natural rhythm. It's the way this works. Some of the other parents that were there asked me about the church. It was all completely natural. There was nothing awkward. There was nothing there was no pressure. They could see that I'm not selling anything. It was just natural. Oh, got talking about it. A wise person once said that the sweetest sound that a person can hear, do you know what it is? It's their own voice, right? If you want people to like you, just shut up and listen, right? They'll go, wow, that's the nicest person I've ever met, right? They like the sound of their own voice, so let them talk. And trust Jesus when he says that the Spirit of God in you will actually draw people to himself, right? Jesus taught this. He was very clear in teaching this in Matthew chapter 5. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world, right? And I'm always encouraged when I read those verses because neither salt nor light make any noise, right? Just silent. But they're powerful. Salt is salty and light is beautiful. They say it really is better here, right? And as you meet with people, that salt and that light will come out of you because you're a child of God. You'd be amazed at how little you need to say to people. If God's really alive in you, they're going to see what God's doing in your life and in your family, in your relationships. They're going to see that you're a nice person, that you're living for different goals. They're going to see it. Salt makes you come back for more. It always does. I remember that old Mark Messier commercial, Lay's potato chips, right? Bet you can't eat just one. You remember that, right? Right? That's what salt does. Light always sends out an invitation, right? You're in a dark place and you see a light, you always go toward it. That's what light does. That's what God does through us who are his children. Guys, once we get a hold of listening, we can move on to the third rhythm, which is story. But we'll do that next week. We'll see you then. Let's pray.